They say vanity is a sin, but for one woman in the 1600s, vanity was a religion that required human sacrifice, and she believed the only way to keep her beauty was to wash herself in the fresh blood of 600 innocent girls. We are taught that royals live in fairy tales, but in a castle perched high in the Carpathian Mountains of Hungary, a real-life horror story was taking place that makes Dracula look like a bedtime story. A countess terrified of losing her beauty believed she had found the ultimate cure for aging. It was not a special cream, and it was not a diet. It was the blood of virgin girls. This is the story of Elizabeth Báthory, the most prolific female murderer in human history, and the dark psychology that drove her to madness. To understand the monster, we first have to understand the world that created her, because Elizabeth was not just a random killer, she was a product of absolute power and absolute isolation. She was born in 1560 into one of the oldest and wealthiest families in Transylvania. The Bathory family was more powerful than the King of Hungary himself. They commanded armies, they owned vast amounts of land, and they ruled over their peasants with an iron fist. In the late 1500s, if you were a peasant living near her lands, she was not just your landlord, she was your judge, your jury, and your executioner. There was no police force you could call on a Bathory. But there was a darkness in her bloodline long before she ever hurt anyone. To keep their wealth within the family, the Bathory clan often married their own cousins. This generations of inbreeding led to a history of madness, epilepsy, and violent rage within the family. As a child, Elizabeth suffered from uncontrollable seizures, which at the time were seen as a sign of being touched by the devil or having a volatile spirit. She was also raised in a time of extreme violence. Hungary was a battlefield constantly torn apart by wars with the Ottoman Empire. Death was everywhere. As a little girl, she witnessed brutal public executions and punishments, where criminals were maimed or killed for minor offenses. She learned very early that life was cheap, and that the rich could do whatever they wanted to the poor without consequence. At the age of 15, she was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier who would become known as the Black Knight of Hungary. Ferenc was a brutal warrior who spent most of his life fighting the Turks. He was known for dancing with the dead bodies of his enemies and for his extreme cruelty. When they moved into Ceret Castle, Elizabeth was often left alone for months at a time while her husband was off at war. She was isolated in a giant cold fortress, surrounded by servants who were terrified of her. It was during these long, lonely years that her dark tendencies began to surface. Her husband, Ferenc, actually encouraged her cruelty. Letters between them show that he taught her creative ways to punish the servants. He once wrote to her, advising her to rub honey on a servant who had made a mistake, and then tie them outside in the summer heat, so that insects and bees would sting them to death. To them, this was not murder, it was discipline. It was just how the nobility treated the peasantry. But when Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth was left completely alone. She was a widow in her mid-40s, staring at her own reflection, and realizing that her youth was fading. For a woman of her status, beauty was her primary currency. She was terrified of becoming old and irrelevant. This fear turned into an obsession, and that obsession turned into a nightmare. The legend says that it all started with a mistake. One morning, a young servant girl was brushing the Countess' hair. The girl pulled a snag too hard and hurt Elizabeth. The Countess, known for her explosive temper, spun around and slapped the girl across the face so hard it drew blood. Some of that blood splattered onto Elizabeth's hand. As she wiped it away, she suffered a profound psychological delusion. She became convinced that the skin beneath the blood looked younger and smoother and more vibrant. In the twisted logic of her mind, she'd found the fountain of youth. If a few drops on her hand worked, she imagined what an entire bath could do. She began to hunt. At first it was easy. She would hire local peasant daughters for maid work at the castle. These girls would enter the heavy wooden gates of Széchet Castle and never be seen again. Down in the cellars, the horror unfolded. The historical testimonies from the trial are grueling to read. Elizabeth did not just kill, she savored the process. She had a circle of 4 loyal servants who helped her. There was an old woman named Ilona Jew, who had nursed the Countess' children, and a man named Fichko, who was described as a physically deformed servant who would bury the bodies. Together they created a factory of death. They would strip the girls and beat them for hours. They used hot tongs to burn their skin. In the winter, they would drag the girls out into the snow, pouring buckets of freezing water over them until they turned into statues of ice. Elizabeth would watch these tortures with a cold detachment, sometimes even participating herself. She would bite the girls' faces and shoulders, tearing chunks of flesh from their bodies in a fit of rage. It was a psychological addiction to absolute power over life and death. For years, nobody could stop her because nobody would believe a peasant over a countess. The local Lutheran minister began to suspect something was wrong when he was asked to perform funeral rites for yet another servant girl who had supposedly died of unknown causes, but he was too afraid to speak up against the most powerful woman in the land. The body count began to rise. 10 became 20, 20 became 50, 50 became hundreds. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. They had to develop a system for disposing of the bodies. At night, the servants would carry the corpses out to the forest or bury them in unmarked graves near the castle walls. But they were killing so many girls that they started to get careless. Bodies were found by villagers. Strange noises were heard coming from the castle at night. The smell of death hung over the valley. The locals started to call her the Blood Countess, and they stopped sending their daughters to work for her. This is where Elizabeth made her fatal mistake. She ran out of peasant girls. A smarter killer might have stopped, but Elizabeth was an addict. She needed fresh victims to feed her delusion. So she started recruiting daughters of the lesser nobility. She opened a finishing school in her castle, claiming she would teach young noblewomen the art of courtly etiquette. These were not peasant girls nobody cared about. These were girls from educated families with names and connections. When these girls started disappearing, people who actually mattered started asking questions. She claimed that one girl had killed herself. She claimed another had died of a sudden illness. But the families demanded to see the bodies, and when they did, they saw the marks of torture. Rumors finally reached the ears of King Matthias II in Vienna. Now the king had a problem. He owed Elizabeth's late husband a massive financial debt. The crown had borrowed huge sums of money from the Bathory family to fund the wars against the Ottomans. The king really did not want to pay it back. He realized that if Elizabeth could be proven a heretic and a murderer, he would not have to pay her a single coin, and he could seize her massive lands for the crown. The political motivation to take her down was huge. The king appointed a man named György Thurzo to investigate. Thurzo was the Palatine of Hungary, which is like a prime minister, and he was actually a cousin of Elizabeth. He knew that this investigation had to be handled carefully. He began collecting testimonies. He traveled to the villages surrounding Chejte Castle and interviewed the locals. The stories he heard were horrific. Over 300 witnesses came forward. They spoke of girls being beaten to death. They spoke of strange screams in the night. They spoke of bodies being thrown over the castle walls for the wolves to eat. Thurzo realized he had enough evidence to act. On the night of December 29th, in the year 1610, he led a raid on Chejte Castle. He wanted to catch her in the act. When his soldiers burst through the doors, they walked into a scene from hell. They found a girl dead in the main hall, her body drained of blood. They found another girl still alive, but dying from her wounds. And in the dungeon, they found several others locked in cages waiting their turn. Elizabeth was sitting in her chambers, seemingly unbothered by the armed men storming her home. She believed she was untouchable. She believed her rank would protect her. She was wrong about the consequences, but she was right about her privilege. The aftermath of the raid showed the stark difference between justice for the rich and justice for the poor. Elizabeth's 4 main servants, who had helped her commit the crimes, were immediately arrested and tortured. The court wanted them to confess everything, and they did. They gave detailed descriptions of the torture methods. They listed the names of victims. One servant named Dorothea Sentes testified that the Countess had a list of over 650 names written in a private diary, though this diary was never found. The punishment for the servants was brutal and swift. They were dragged to a public square. Their fingers were ripped off with hot pincers to punish the hands that had tortured the girls. Then they were thrown into a fire and burned alive while the crowds watched. But Elizabeth Báthory was never put on trial. Her family name was too important. To execute a noblewoman of her status would have caused a scandal that could have destabilized the entire kingdom. The king wanted her land, but the nobles wanted to protect their own immunity. So they made a deal. Elizabeth would not be executed. Instead, she would be imprisoned for the rest of her life within her own castle. She was taken back to Chejte Castle and placed in a small room. Masons were brought in to brick up the windows and the doors. They left only a small slit in the wall, just big enough to pass a plate of food and a cup of water. She was literally entombed alive in her own home. Imagine the psychological horror of that punishment. She was a woman who was obsessed with her own image, who needed constant validation, and who was terrified of the dark. Now she was locked in a tiny dark room with no mirrors, no servants, and no audience. She remained in that room for 4 years. The guards said she would often refuse to eat. She would pace the small floor in the dark, mumbling to herself. Some say she went completely insane. Others say she remained defiant to the very end, never admitting guilt, never showing a shred of remorse. On August 21st, 1614, a guard noticed that the plate of food he had passed through the slit the day before had not been touched. He peered through the hole and saw the Countess lying face down on the floor. Elizabeth Báthory was dead at the age of 54. She died in the dark, alone and unloved. But her death was only the beginning of her legend. Almost immediately, the stories began to twist and grow. The villagers whispered that she was a vampire. They said she had made a pact with the devil for eternal life. The story of the bloodbaths, which was never actually proven in the official investigation, became the defining image of her life. Writers and poets later latched onto this image, creating the myth of the Blood Countess who bathed in red to stay young. This myth eventually inspired Bram Stoker when he was writing Dracula. But the truth is actually scarier than the vampire myth. Vampires are monsters we can understand. They are supernatural creatures who kill because they need to feed. Elizabeth Báthory was a human being. She was a woman who had everything: wealth, beauty, power, and family. Yet it was not enough. Her story is a terrifying lesson in what happens when a human being is given unchecked power over others. It is a study in narcissism and sadism. Psychologists today, looking back at the evidence, believe she likely suffered from severe narcissistic personality disorder and sexual sadism. The torture gave her a sense of control that she felt she was losing as she aged. The pain of others made her feel powerful and alive. There is also a theory that she was the victim of a massive conspiracy. Some modern historians argue that the number of victims was exaggerated by the king to justify seizing her land. They point out that there was no physical evidence of 600 bodies. They argue that she was a strong, independent woman in a time when men ruled everything, and that she was taken down because she was too powerful. But while the numbers might have been exaggerated, the core truth remains. The testimonies of the survivors, the witnesses, and the servants all paint a consistent picture of a woman who enjoyed inflicting pain. Even today, if you visit the ruins of Chejte Castle in Slovakia, you can feel the heavy atmosphere of the place. It sits on a lonely hill overlooking the village where so many girls were taken from. The wind blows through the crumbling stone walls where the Countess once walked. It is a place of silence and shadows. Locals still tell the stories of the crying that can be heard at night. It stands as a monument to human cruelty and the destructive power of vanity. We like to think that we have moved past this kind of barbarism. We have laws and police and human rights, but the psychology that drove Elizabeth Báthory still exists. The obsession with youth and beauty, the desire for power over others, the belief that wealth puts you above the law, these are all very modern problems. Elizabeth just took them to their absolute extreme. She showed us the monster that lives inside the human ego when all constraints are removed. Her life asks us a difficult question. If you had absolute power and no one could stop you, what would you become? Would you be benevolent, or would the darkness take over? For Elizabeth, the answer was written in blood. She chased immortality, and in a strange, twisted way she found it. She wanted to be remembered forever, and she is. She is remembered not for her beauty, which faded and rotted away, but for her brutality. She is the Countess of Blood, the woman who tried to pause time by destroying the lives of others. As we close this file on the Blood Countess, it is worth remembering the victims. The hundreds of nameless girls who walked through those castle gates hoping for a job, a better life, or a future, and instead found a nightmare. They are the true cost of her vanity. History often remembers the killers, but we must remember the lives they stole. The story of Elizabeth Báthory is not just a ghost story, it is a warning. It is a mirror held up to the darkest parts of human nature, showing us exactly what we are capable of when we lose our humanity in the pursuit of ourselves.